I feel incredibly privileged to be able to be the moderator of this particular panel. And I think in light of the opening keynote that we heard this morning, I see that a number of you, I think, were here this morning to hear Chris Pike really talk about the state of green building, particularly as it relates to real estate, which I think really segues very well into this discussion about what value really means. I think for those of us that have been practicing professionals for many years, the cost question is one that constantly comes up. We wish that it wouldn't. We wish that the conversation was a little different, but it always does come up, particularly with folks that are not familiar with what the value of building green really is. So I will back up and just say, good morning, everyone. Just wake everybody up a little bit. I'm seeing a little bit of slouching going on, so good morning. Again, like I said, it's an honor to be with you here at EarthX, surrounded by some of the brightest minds in green building. One of the things that I've always loved about the green building industry is that it is so diverse in terms of expertise and viewpoint, right? Architects, engineers, innovators. At the end of the day, we are all doers. Everyone on this panel is a doer. This here that's going on today, this is our room. This is our space. This is our tribe. So thank you for having me. I want to talk honestly for just a quick moment. For too long, green building has been pigeonholed as this expensive option. I think we heard the word premium this morning, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that word today in this panel. It's an aspirational add-on for those with an extra budget or just some kind of moral mission. But I think that you and I and everyone in this room know that that's really an outdated narrative about what green building is. The data tells a very different story. The real world outcomes is what we're really after, the deliverables, the value of what green building can provide. So this panel is really about flipping that script. We're not going to talk about how, cost. We're going to talk about the value of it, and we're going to talk about how that's really a false dichotomy. We're going to explore what happens when design, construction, and finance speak the same language, right? That's always a good thing. How can we use performance-based thinking to shift cost-centric decisions into value-driven outcomes, right? Let me say that one more time. Shift from cost-centric decision-making to value-driven outcomes. And most importantly, how can we future-proof our projects in a market that's rapidly changing? So now let me introduce the brilliant minds that are joining us today, all more brilliant than I. First, I'd like to introduce Claudio Leon, architect and sustainability advocate. Claudio, my apologies, sir. Claudio brings a dual lens of hands-on experience and technical rigor. We had a conversation before this. He talked about digging into earthship builds in New Mexico to leading envelope and renovation work for school district projects across Texas. He's deeply committed to performance, longevity, and life cycle value. And he's here to share how design choices can really unlock this return on investment. And Claudio, I'd just like to give you an opportunity right now to talk a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know, architect, graduated from University of Houston. I took a long shot. I left the US and I went to Germany to practice sustainability. I learned a lot, and one of the things that I realized is that over there, besides all the engineering teams that you have involved in projects, they have a building physics engineer part of the team. And for me, coming back to States and 10 years later, I noticed we're missing that piece still here. And when we practice architecture, we as architects, we're not trained to building envelope. We're not trained to building physics. And I think going back to a previous presentation, lead consultants can fill in the gap nowadays here. That's what I have.
Very good. Thank you so much, Claudio. Also, we have Lauren Clark with Turner Construction. She is a strategist and project executive. Lauren has seen it all, from high-performance public builds to cutting-edge private developments. She understands the trade-offs and tipping points on construction sites and really works to translate that design ambition into the real-world delivery. And I think that's so important. And as someone who has been doing this for a minute, you can design the best building in the world. If you can't build it, and you can't finance it, which we'll get to that, it doesn't matter. And so I'm very excited to have Lauren on this panel. She's going to speak to the tension between aspiration and budget, and how smart project phasing can really make this work. So Lauren, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. So went to SMU with my background in mechanical engineering, master's in engineering management, and then landed in construction. And from there, just through a series of people asking, hey, we have these sustainability needs. Is this something you'd be willing to help with on this project? And a first boss who was very passionate that everyone who worked under him needed to have their lead GA at minimum, if not an AP, started building a career in sustainability. And so, carry forward about 15 years, and I'm managing all of the sustainability and the strategy for Turner's Dallas office and helping with a lot of national projects for that as well. Circularity in the economy is a little more of the focus area, but it's been really fun watching, especially Dallas, and how it's evolved over the last several years, and how there is such a push to make strides forward with sustainable green building.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Really, really happy to have you here. Also, very, very excited to have my friend and colleague, pleased to be able to call her my friend, Charlene Hadinger. She is the president of the Texas Pace Authority. And I want to say, if you've ever heard, we'd love to, but we can't afford it, Charlene is here to tell you, yes, you can, right? She leads the Texas PACE program, unlocking private financing for energy and water efficiency. Charlene's going to help us break down how creative financing can bridge that cost-value gap, and why it's time to treat sustainability as a smart financial decision, as a base building option, not as a premium. So Charlene, you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. I am a policy wonk. I started out in Capitol Hill, various committees, ended up with the leadership, and everything we do at the Capitol is collaborative and cooperative. At least it used to be when I was there, probably before most of you were born. But anyway, this was my go-back-to-work job, getting the Texas PACE Act adopted. I didn't know anything about the environment or financing, but I have fallen in love with this. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary. We now serve 105 local governments, about 75% of the Texas population, and we have facilitated more than $500 million, $500 million in energy and water savings in the last 10 years. It's a great program that nobody's heard of, so I'm very honored to be with all you smart people today. Would love to share what we've been able to do and hopefully help you get your projects done too.
Thank you so much, Charlene. And I refuse to acknowledge that it's been 10 years since we started having that conversation. To round out this panel of experts and this brilliant minds up here, we've got Riley McKillop. He is the principal economist at AutoCase. Riley's going to bring us the numbers, right? He specializes in cost-benefit and triple bottom line analysis on municipal and state-level climate action plans, carbon-neutral buildings policy, campus development master plans, and green stormwater infrastructure projects. But at the end of the day, he's helping clients quantify the total return on sustainable investments, from avoided risk to community benefit. Love that we're talking about community benefit, because really talking about value in the context of pure dollars up front doesn't work, right? And so really excited that we're going to bring that you're going to bring that to this conversation. Riley's work really makes what is invisible visible, and I'm very excited to hear more from you. Riley, you want to talk a little bit about your background?
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. Traveled all the way from Toronto, Canada to get here today, and very, very fortunate to experience a bit of heat compared to some of the wintry weather that we've been getting back home recently. So in terms of how economics can really play a role in terms of overall building design infrastructure, is really that we have economic models that we are able to measure performance for stock markets, for any type of capital investment. Those similar frameworks can be applied across building design and building decisions, and that's really what we do, is we empower design teams, building owners, to really uncover some of the additional economic benefits associated with some of their design, and really enable them to move past just upfront cost considerations to really value the things that matter. And folks, we all know what matters in the building occupant experience, making sure it's operational efficient, so we're able to provide the dollars and cents in terms of that business case narrative.
Thank you so much. So what I really want to point out here, and then we're going to get into the questions, is that you really have the entire gamut of expertise that really is required to make a building project work, to really make it valuable in the long run. We have that expertise here on the stage. So as you're formulating your questions, think about what phase of the project, of the process, your question might apply to, or maybe it applies to all of them and you're not sure about that. So be getting that done. So I'm going to start with this concept, value over cost. We had a conversation before we sat down on this panel, we had a call, and we really, I think, all landed on this idea that this type of practice, this type of building, this is not optional anymore. I mean, we're having the conversations this morning about risk and resilience. We're having the conversation about what it means in large real estate portfolios. So at the end of the day, and I think maybe, Lauren, let's start with you, because I'm looking at you right now.
Hey,
Let's
bring it
start
on.
with you, because you're out there, you're on the construction side of things, getting these things built. Why is this not optional? Why is it urgent?
Well, I mean, you're building buildings, and it goes back to you're delivering a product that your owner is going to be happy with, either for the developer, for the owner of the building itself, or for whichever tenant you're fitting it out with or fitting it up for. And you want their experience to be one that they both enjoy being in, but also one that they feel so much more comfortable in. And there have been plenty of studies about buildings that have been rated, have higher ratings for USGBC programs like WELL or LEED. And especially, you have, huge opinions with college students, but college students and those entering the workforce all have been voting that, yes, I feel more comfortable in a building that's WELL certified, that's LEED certified. And I think that speaks volumes to the experience that the end user is going to have as they're in the building. And so for those who are in the developer position or the ones whose purse strings are tied to the project, obviously there's an awareness of the cost implications that are going into the building. And if you're, you can do certain design criteria for the buildings where it can be as little as like 0 to 2% additional project cost. But if you're going into some of the deep green, sustainable initiatives that you can do, that'll really make a difference with the longevity of the product and really getting your ROI in over several years or decades. That might be more of a 20% cost up front, but it pays off later. And so it's really getting all the brains together early for the developer side, for the owner side, and then talking with the design team, because they're the ones who are sitting there kind of in the very early meetings, who are thinking through, okay, what are we doing? What are our options for different designs that we can do that will impact our building for sustainability? And so I think that cost awareness is very important up front. And the earlier you're planning this, the more you can get done and the more you can look through the numbers to say, hey, having an energy offset's really important to us. How are ways we can do this? And if that's something where as you start building, the owner's like, actually, that would be a great idea. Let's see how we can throw this in. It's obviously going to cost way more money at the last minute than if it's something that you've been talking with your designer about since the very beginning. And so a lot of that also plays into how much it's going to cost you.
So I picked up on a couple of concepts there, and I knew that we would start this conversation and then I would have a script and then I would go off script. Really excited about what you're talking about, where there's these options that start to emerge and folks start to have ideas during the construction phase. But obviously, it's much more cost effective to start having that conversation on the design side. And so, Claudio, I want to go to you and talk about what are your conversations that you're having with clients in the context of what Lauren is saying, and how do you kind of help them understand what that value could be?
Yeah, I think from my side in the early stages, 2006, when I started getting passionate about LEED, the question's still the same. When am I going to get my money back, right? That's always the question. Environmental issues get behind that first question. Based on the experience that I've had, I'm truly confident to say that whether it's a small roofing project or like a big institutional building, putting together an energy modeling, coupling it with a life cycle cost analysis of different variations of the building envelope or any other equipment inside the building can provide a high performance building, but that needs to be done earlier in the design phases. Fortunately, a lot of small companies don't have that luxury, right, to have that extra staff, but I think starting with small little projects, small little roofing projects, envelope projects can get people trained into that aspect. 'Cause as we saw in the presentation earlier, the more you do it, the more experience you get, and the better performance you get throughout time in the projects.
And I love that you're talking about, things like the building envelope. I think these are not things that your typical client is necessarily thinking about as they walk in the door. And so I'm wondering how do you really have that conversation with them, embedding that long-term performance and resilience conversation into the design. And then in a second, we're going to go from that. I want to talk to Riley a little bit about what value really means in the context of that design conversation.
For example, we always ask about the money, but also we have to put into equation the longevity of the product, right? When we put the study time together, let's say the building's going to last 30 years, but you're going to have to replace whether you go to a cheaper roof system in 10 years or whether you go to a more resilient product, high energy efficient product that's going to last longer, then the equation changes. So that's the conversation where we need to go to.
Absolutely. Riley?
Yeah, and I think an important perspective here is really the timeline of the project and how long we want to capture costs and benefits for. So if we want to be intentional in terms of generating value, we really just need to flip the script in terms of whether or not we're looking at short-term decision-making versus long-term value creation. So when we align the economic use life of a building 30 years plus, there's a lot of good opportunity that we can proactively generate value and not necessarily assigned to a distinct cost item. So I think it's more about being able to take a longer-term perspective, understand that these buildings are going to be operational for 30 plus years, and you really have one good opportunity to make a good impact. I think the big thing here is about being intentional. So there's many different ways that you can design a particular design goal, being able to have life cycle cost analysis and be able to tie total cost of ownership is a very key consideration to avoid future pitfalls for building owners.
Thank you so much for that. And I think, I think it's interesting we have this discussion about value, and I think we all in this room probably have varying definitions, but they're probably in the same universe. I'm wondering, are our clients, are these folks that are engaging us as professionals, do they have the same definition of value? And I think I want to go to Charlene and really talk about, how do we communicate the value of green investments, not to architects and engineers as we are, here in this room. I am not an architect. I want to make sure everybody's clear about that. But no offense. But how do we communicate the value of green investments to CFOs, not just sustainability people?
Well, they're trained to say no because they need to make as much money as possible, as shortly as possible, as quickly as possible. And I think they're all starting to realize, as is everybody, catching up to the folks in this room, that cheap isn't value anymore. And that they are opening themselves up to higher insurance costs, greater risk. Not just a few years ago, people were desperate for space, and they would pay anything for crappy space. Well, that's not true anymore in any sector. And so all of a sudden, the tenants who are stuck paying the utility bills are paying attention to what they are. And so value is starting to mean more. Our power is only going to get more expensive. Our water is only going to get harder to get. And so there's more openness to this. Now, does that mean that the property manager has a clue about how to talk about anything beyond NOI, let alone internal rate of return or asset value, which brings greater profits to these CFOs? But if nobody is explaining it to them, they're not going to get it. So when it comes to, okay, my HVAC is dead, my occupancy is at 50% because nobody's comfortable in this building, PACE makes a whole lot of sense, except folks don't know about it. But because we are going to help them with a long-term, 100% non-recourse, non-accelerating loan that doesn't have a down payment, that can be used on energy and water-saving measures or to create power on site. It sounds too good to be true. But the developers aren't looking at it because what we can do for the future tenants or what we can do for the environment. They're looking at it because the interest rate on PACE assessment loans is less than equity. And senior lenders are loaning less, and they've got to find more capital from someplace else. And all of a sudden, PACE looks really good to them. Because they are able, if they spend a little bit more to build a better building, they're going to save money on their interest rates. And that is something that took us a while to be able to explain if we could just get in front of the CFOs. But they used to push everything back. I don't want to pay for that HVAC because it's all pain. And the conversation in this room that you get, that we've got to figure out how to help everybody else get, is that it's not pain, it's opportunity. It's opportunity for less expensive money, it's opportunity for lowering operating costs, it's opportunity for increasing the value of the building because we're increasing the net operating income on that building. Lots of opportunity. We just have to figure out the vocabulary, who we need to talk to, how we get those folks to take it seriously. Nobody's going to use PACE financing until they have decided to make these commitments. And how do we do that? When the building owner is going saying, I need to replace my HVAC, or the developer is going, I want to build this building, if they're talking to people that have only been trained to build the code, it's all lost opportunity, long and short run.
Thank you so much for that. You know, Charlene, I'm thinking back, I guess it's been 10 years, I will acknowledge, begrudgingly. You know, I remember when we first started talking about PACE. At that time, I was doing a lot of work with clients that owned, not historic as in historically designated, but older buildings and I'm from El Paso, Texas, in downtown El Paso, Texas. And I remember the number one barrier to being able to revitalize those buildings and really achieve what at that time was the city's downtown revitalization goals was the cost, the upfront cost to bring those buildings built in, 1910, 1920, up to not just code, but high performing so that they were leasable, right? We heard Chris talk this morning about, what that means in terms of being able to attract tenants, right? The value to them in terms of a green building. And it was mechanical, electrical, plumbing upgrades that were the number one barrier. And what we saw in the public sector was a lot of grants available for things like facade improvements. Well, we appreciate that, but that was not where the cost was. And so that was something I think that was really valuable about PACE then, and I think still valuable now. So having worked both inside and outside city government, I want to ask you guys, what shifts in mindset, I'm talking about 10 years ago, what shifts in mindset have you seen that help push this idea of a value-based decision system? And I'll start with Lauren, and then we'll just come all the way across the panel.
Well, I think Dallas kind of has taken it upon themselves to move the needle with some of the building codes. And so by doing that, they've forced owners or anyone who's working with within the city of Dallas at least to hold themselves to a higher standard for sustainable building. So for the last several years, building code was essentially LEED Silver. Now it's currently LEED Gold. And so that was one way where the city had forced people to look at costs to say, okay, here are things that we're doing that are basically building code that are moving our buildings and those who are building within our city limits forward. And so some of the ways that you're able to do that, kind of going back to the design, you're able to start thinking through, okay, are we using any sort of alternate design methods here? I mean, for our structure, would we want to look at mass timber, or are we going to focus on recycled content for materials? I mean, does steel make sense? There's a higher global warming potential, but it's also a highly recycled content product. And so there's several different trade-offs that you're looking at as you're evaluating the cost. And I mean, for the construction, what really comes down to, you have a balance between value engineering and the schedule that you're trying to keep. And so if you have an owner who's planning ahead and has some flexibility with either when their building needs to be turned over or just what they're willing to try out for the sake of their building, you have a lot more options with the costs that you're dealing with and how you can make a difference in your building and what it looks like for sustainability.
And just really quickly before we move on to Riley, in terms of the sort of shift that's happened over, say, the last decade, I'm wondering, Lauren, what would you say, in a word or two, what is the number one reason that these high performance features get value engineered out of a project?
I mean, it is money. I mean, you look at if you're doing photovoltaic for a project, in that if we're looking at scorecards for LEED Gold or Platinum, I mean, that's 18 points of your I think it's either 70 or 80, depending on which rating you're going for. So I mean, that's a huge chunk of it. And I mean, it's very costly. One project I'm on right now, they are using photovoltaic to offset 50% was the original goal, and then they had to add some theatrical lighting in one area of the building, and so that created another, I think, 400 kilowatt hours that the building was producing, and then all of a sudden our energy model had to come and redo everything and look at those numbers all over again, and everyone's going, oh my gosh, like, do we have money in the budget to add more photovoltaic panels? Because I mean, that's a big feature right there. Or I mean, do we need these lighting features, or what are things we can do here? And so I think it just is difficult where you have these features that do truly move the needle a lot in terms of resiliency and in terms of net zero, or just what you're doing with the energy that the building is producing. And because they either are building envelope systems or they end up being mechanical systems, and in general, those are the most expensive line items in your budget anyway when you're building a new building. And so that's where you start looking first for a lot of the value engineering.
I love that you said that, and I sort of knew you were going to say that, and I wanted to set that up for Riley because I think that, you know, we all talk about value and we talk about, you know, sort of integrated decision making. We really want to be long-term thinkers, you know, even as a client, right? I'll put myself in the shoes of the client. I want a great building. I want a building that's going to provide value over many, many years. But when the rubber hits the road and I'm looking at costs and I'm saying, I don't have enough money right now, or I can't, and I'm going to get back to that, Charlie, with I don't have enough money. But at the end of the day, what I have seen is that it really does come down to just what is that dollar amount, and if I take it out, am I closer to my budget target? Riley, how can we start to shift that conversation, or has it shifted in terms of when they say, take this thing out? Well, guess what? It's not just that dollar you're seeing on that spreadsheet.
Yeah, it's a huge point for sure, because I think most folks will focus again up that upfront cost and really that single line item. But I think it's not a very good viewpoint, or it's not a very efficient investment if you're only looking at costs. When we start thinking about the opportunity costs, whether or not there's a trade-off, that's where you're able to start building business cases. So I think that's really a growing need in this space, is being able to provide a business case and ultimately be able to showcase that if I go with my business as usual decision, that it's not just a single upfront cost that I might be spending. It might actually reduce the overall building performance throughout time. I might see higher tenant turnover. I might actually have some forced building improvements that I need to make from local building performance standards. So there's a whole trade-off language that we can speak to, and it's mainly driven by business cases. Again, you can design to an overall project target or goal many different ways to achieve that particular goal. All will have differing costs and differing impacts. So I think being able to measure those on an apples-to-apples basis and lead with a business case is probably one of the growing things. And one thing that I've noticed specifically, more on the financial side of things, is that a lot of REITs will have investors who are a lot more kind of conducive with these type of analytics and want to understand what type of value that they're actually generating. So I think that's one noticeable thing I've seen compared to building owners who now have to speak to their investors who are expecting that their dollars are actually generating good value.
And I think that the conversation also becomes about, you know, what tools do we have as professionals to really articulate and illustrate to our clients what the impact of those decisions really is, right? It's not just about sort of subtracting the dollar amount at the end of the estimate, right? It's about really looking at what is this going to cost you in the long run and being able to visualize that. Shar, I'm going to skip over you real quick and go to Claudio because I feel like this is a question for him, but then I want to come back. So, Claudio, when you're let's build a scenario here. We've designed a project. It's the best green building in the world. Turner is building it for us. We're having this conversation, and we're $1 million over budget. We're $2 million over budget, whatever that is. And we're looking at this, and somebody's saying, I want this line item out because it gets me to my budget goal. What tools are you using, or what conversation are you having to sort of articulate what Riley is talking about?
Well, I think we have to sit down with the client and talk about longevity of the building. We have to bring it up. We have to be clear about it, because I think transparency is one of the things that we as lead advocates should target transparency. But that's the goal. Performance plus technology plus longevity adds value to the product that we deliver.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm going to say also, I think that there is definitely an urgency to be able to demonstrate that to a client, right? Really be able to. I used to say it, when I was working in government all the time, that, if I was speaking to an elected representative or I was even speaking to our CFO, I needed to draw that in crayon, right? I can't just say it, right? So, Charlene, talk to me a little bit. We're talking about all these challenges. Clearly, cost is the issue. Clearly, we want to achieve value. When should we start talking about pace? When should that happen? Way at the beginning? How does that come into this process? Does that come in when we're having this conversation? Talk to us a little bit about the financing mechanism.
The sooner the better, because if the designers of the project are aware that the owner is interested in accessing PACE financing, they're going to design to make that happen. We won't approve a project unless the projected savings exceed the projected cost over the life of these assessments, which can be as long as 30 years.
I'm sorry, Char, can I stop you real quick? Can you say that one more time? That last bit you said about projected costs?
I've already forgot what I said.
I put her on the spot. I stopped her because I thought that was so important to really understand.
Oh, okay, so PACE financing stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. The local government has stepped in and created an economic tool that allows a private lender to borrow money, or private lender to loan money to a private property owner, commercial, industrial, or multifamily. But the funding can only be used for measures that reduce power use, reduce water use, or create power on site, reducing demand. So if the designers of the property or the designers of the project know that the owner is going to access PACE financing or wants to, they're going to design to create savings. Because unlike a lot of other frou-frou things that are promised to owners, PACE financing is not approved unless an independent third-party engineer validates with their stamp, their license, that the savings are projected to exceed the cost over the long run.
There it is.
Yeah, I got there. Thank you, Nicole. So Nicole and I go way back because the Plaza Hotel in El Paso, Hilton's first high-rise, sat empty for 26 years. And that PACE program for El Paso County was created because the judge got tired of looking at that building, and she wanted to revitalize downtown, which is kind of hard to do when you have a big empty building in the middle of it. So Hilton's son married Elizabeth Taylor for about 6 seconds. And so Hollywood came to the Plaza Hotel, and they'd go gambling in Juarez, and they'd come back and stay in the hotel. So next time you're back, come to this beautiful PACE project and have a drink in the penthouse in Elizabeth Taylor's room. But
That's one of my favorite stories. And by the way, that bar is excellent.
that's what I hear.
Not
It
that
looks
I,
great.
know what the bars are
Well,
like.
you got to take me there next time. So in Dallas, think of the Butler Brothers Hotel across from City Hall, which is now 2 Marriott hotels that enter from different streets. It's so big, high-end loft apartments and first floor retail. Or you can talk about the Dallas Paint and Body Shop, a $70,000 project, our smallest project in Texas along I-35. New construction would be the Swexen, the JW Marriott, but there's a half a dozen 1980s office buildings around this area that have used PACE. When we got started, money was free, power was free, water was free. None of those things are true anymore.
No. And I think that, that's part of that shifting landscape in this conversation that we're having is folks are really starting to feel the pain of what these costs are, what energy costs, what resource costs are. So I want to come back, and I'm going to start with Riley, and then I want to go to Claudio. But Riley, we're talking about, making these decisions. We're talking about having the information and really not focusing in on a single factor, i.e. cost. How can life cycle cost analysis really reshape the decision-making during early stage design? What metrics in that context do you think are most surprising to stakeholders in terms of positive surprise?
Positive surprise would be how much they're expected to spend on operations and maintenance and replacement. I think those are very widely overlooked concepts, and They'll look at, okay, what is it going to cost me today in terms of the lowest? But when you take a total cost of ownership perspective, there's a lot of unhidden things that will pop up that will definitely impact the bottom line and the overall performance of your building. So I think that being able to uncover those type of outcomes soon, and it's kind of like buying a car and saying, well, I have a $500 car that's going to require me to do essentially an oil change every single week or top it up with oil every single week, or I could buy a bit better of a car for $1,000. Most folks understand and do these naturally in terms of their day-to-day decision makings, but when it comes to bigger overall investment projects, for some reason, some folks don't necessarily want to take that next step, but really it's the prudent next step to select the correct financial efficient investment, let's call it.
So to get them at the table to have Riley's conversation, the world is making that easier. Now their insurance costs are higher, their power costs are higher, their water costs are higher, their requirements from local government are higher, money's much harder to get, but then there are the storms, right? If you don't have strong windows, that limb is going to go right through the window and now you have water damage. Do you still have a roof next week? There are new risks that didn't exist 10 years ago. And if you can get them at the table to discuss that, not only can you show them, hey, there are lots of different ways that we can help you pay for this, but there are other bigger costs that your advisors and your financial people should be bringing to your attention.
And the other thing too is really, to your point, is business operation or continuity of business. If you're not able to operate that building, or you're not able to actually have tenants within that space during certain inclement events, whether it be forest fires, et cetera, that's a direct bottom line impact. So I think a lot of folks are waking up and starting to actually put those on a business case framework and weighing some of those costs off.
I will tell you, just as a little interjection, I'm working with a client right now that works on energy performance with school districts in California. And there is a school district in California that on certain days, when the weather, particularly, we were speaking specifically about when it gets too hot to operate the building, which I think is a whole other conversation that we could have. But what was interesting is that that school district was experiencing a significant number of shutdown days where they had to, email parents and say, there's no school today because the buildings are too hot, right? Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. It's not just about sort of running that equipment and, the cost to keep the building cool. It's literally now that they cannot operate the school on that day. How much money did the school district lose per day that was closed? The number is big. And so the conversation that my client and I are now having with that school district is, how can we save you those days? So if you can, install XYZ system and we can guarantee you that you can operate under these conditions, you will actually be able to reduce your shutdown days by X%. That's a conversation that I don't remember having 10 years ago, but we're having it now.
Because you don't live where there's snow days.
I don't. Well, although I will say that in El Paso, if there is a flurry, we all just shut down. We're like, oh my God, no. I'm going to hide. Anyways, go ahead, Charlene.
If that school were in Texas, the state comptroller's office within the state energy conservation office has a program, which is a play on words, Lone Star, LOANSTAR. It's a revolving loan fund, very low interest rates. The state will actually send the public entity free engineers to help get them started. It's very similar to PACE for public buildings. I'm sorry your school isn't in Texas, but for those of you who work in public space, call the State Energy Conservation Office and learn about that program.
Yeah, but this is a great conversation. I mean, that particular client is in California, but what I will tell you is happening in El Paso right now, particularly the El Paso Independent School District, and I say this as a mom. I got 2 kids in EPISD, and EPISD just shut down, I think, 16 schools. They're going to close 16 schools because they can't afford to maintain and operate them. As a parent, I'm livid. Why didn't you make better decisions before it was time to shut it down? So now that's a more complicated political conversation, but I'm going to come back. Claudio, I really want to, this is such a robust conversation. How do you embed this conversation, long-term performance, resilience, into your design decisions, especially when you've got clients that are pushing for these sort of short-term savings? Like, how do you incorporate all these factors that they may not be thinking about?
So I left in 2012 and I came back at 2022 to practice architecture here in South Texas. And one of the things that I tell my friends is that when I left, Whataburger costed like around $5. Now, 10 years after, now it's $10, $11. So for me, it's the cost, the net present value, and I think you're more familiar with the actual value of money. It changes. It's dynamic. It's not something that we can consider, well, it costs this much, but if you save this much money, you're saving or you're missing on the value of investing this much money, because the money will eventually, or the equipment, whatever you're trying to save, it's not going to cost the same in 10 years. It's going to cost more. And so I think that's where the tools come really handy. PACE requires an engineering study, right?
Yes.
In order to
So it's legit.
certify it. Exactly. And I think there's tools out there. There's sustainability consultants that know how to work those tools, where you can actually see or you can actually insert those the terminology that as an architect, I wasn't familiar 10 years ago. Net present value, inflation rates. Now that everybody's talking about inflation, that's really very interesting topics that we should be having with our client at the table. You're investing right now, but you know that in 1 year, less in 10 years, the product that you're trying to skip will have 3 times the cost that it's doing right now. That's just an example.
Absolutely. Y'all are itching. So let's go Riley, and then we'll go Charlene.
Yeah, I think the other really good thing, to your point of cost escalation, is what you pay every single year to operate that building. Especially in the kind of post-COVID era, we've seen utility rates absolutely skyrocket. So just from, if you want to make your building non-energy efficient, you will pay for that directly year over year, and that will directly impact your NOI and impact what that building's ultimately valued. So that's another big thing that we're seeing a lot of folks really take into consideration, is that my utility bills are they've gone crazy over the past 5 years. As a building owner, what can I do? So I think it's also being able to provide those savings and say, well, you're able to avoid future escalation by having some type of solar generation on site. You're able to avoid that water utility rate escalation by being more mindful about potable water use. So I think it's that annual utility escalation has been a huge, huge driver of what we've seen in these business cases.
I was going to say, you can also add on top, almost geometrically increase the value not only of what you're doing, but your access to capital. So you can use any lender you want in the PACE program, but one of them, PACE Equity, has created with USGBC an extra higher level of quality savings, because we require it in Texas, but not everybody else does in the rest of the country. It's called CIRRUS. So there are 2 projects that we have that we've closed this year. One is a gut rehab of an office building in Tyler. The other is an H-E-B grocery store in Waco that's going to be apartments and all kinds of cool stuff. And the H-E-B is coming back. Both of those are eligible because of the extra CIRRUS program on top of our program, significant 6-figure utility incentives from Encore. There are ways you can start layering these things together for significant savings. If you are working with anyone in a USDA rural energy map, which is most of Texas geographically, they'll give you 25% grant. You don't pay it back. Up to $500,000 for an energy efficiency project, up to $1 million for a solar project. So just take 25% of the cost off the top. I mean, there are significant, for somebody who's looking, these will more than pay for themselves. And the more you can layer those upfront dollars, the quicker you get to that payback.
I have just a couple more questions, and I promise I'm going to open it up and let you guys ask these brilliant people some questions. But I think what's interesting that we're talking about, we're all sort of on the provider side of this equation, right? Who's not sitting up here today is someone on the client side, right? And I think we talked about during our coordinating discussion, really awareness. How aware are our clients, entities that are getting ready to embark on a big project, How much do they understand about what goes into this? I think there's a couple of different examples. Part of my former life in government, I worked a lot in the housing space, right? And so when you're working with developers on housing developments, right, there is always a capital stack, right? And what I started to really see shift over time was how savvy developers were getting about some of these kinds of, I'm going to call them incentives, but we're talking about sort of financial components that can get, plugged into this stack that really, at the end of the day, is what make their deals pencil. And I think that's something that, to me, has been very different. I do not see that, though, outside of very professional developers. When I look at government, I talked about school districts a minute ago. I worked in municipal government. Don't get me started. About how ill-equipped we are as we walk into these, right? And so the question becomes, and this is an interesting one for everybody, what's one question or one component you wish you would see in every RFP when it comes to green building value? And anybody can jump in here. I will start and just say, I wish it was mentioned at all, right? I really wish that, because again, on the government side of things, dollar decisions are made years ahead of the release of an RFP, right? So typically the money that we've allocated is never going to be enough for what's actually going to get built, right? And so I think that an acknowledgement of how that building should perform, not just what its use is on its face, but what value should it be providing to that community, those are things I'd like to see. What do you guys think?
I mean, I think to that note of just seeing it in the RFP, that's huge. And then from the building side, I think it's always interesting seeing success stories of, what are green buildings that you've done, that you've completed successfully in whatever building certification programs that are available to your area. I mean, there's so many different ones that owners can do. And, if you're not trying to pay for a lead, like what are other aspects that you did to your building that were impactful to the environment and to the life cycle of the building, and how did you do it? How is this successful? And then, I think even in some of the early design meetings, contractors at least have white pages of studies that we've done for, one building I'm working on in Westlake. We were looking at doing geothermal, but there wasn't enough temperature variation in the soil for it to be a feasible option. And so those are, I think, interesting things where you're like, look, we've been thinking through this. I mean, not just, you have the design side who's usually the leading thinker for sustainable options for a building, but then also you have the contractor who's walking in lockstep with your design team being like, okay, here are the things that we've thought through, and being able to showcase that to the owner. I mean, there was one success story that Turner had at USC in California where there really wasn't anything about green building in that RFP. And we had some green experts who came to the interview and asked the owner, hey, have you considered this? There are rebate options here. There are options that we think would go really well with the design that you have. And just with a few tweaks and, some budget considerations, we think this could be a real success story for your campus, and ended up winning the project because of that conversation. And so both, as the contractor, having the awareness and just the knowledge that you can share with an owner, and for the owner side, being open to hearing, okay, what are things maybe I haven't thought of that we could consider?
I love that.
Yeah, I think from my perspective from RFPs, just because I definitely have read through and spent a good time of my life going through those PDF documents, I think it's really kind of marrying two concepts. Intentionality, because a lot of these RFPs are just kind of littered with many different objectives, but they're not really getting to the true sense of why they're asking for those services or what that project's going for. So I think intentionality in terms of goal setting and prioritizing those, so that way in the first project kickoff meeting you can say, hey, we're working towards X, Y, and Z, and you can kind of keep that as your guiding bearing moving forward. So during value engineering, if a cost conversation comes up, you can say, well, hey, building owner, didn't we kick off this entire engagement with these three kind of premises driving this design or driving the outcomes of the project? So that's one. I think the other one that we've all kind of touched on here is just having the ability to make these decisions sooner. So being able to have all these design teams meet together early on and being able to influence design at the right time. It's a lot easier to make changes with a pencil than a shovel. So.
I love that. A lot easier to make changes with a pencil than a shovel. Although I'm pretty effective with a shovel. I'm playing with you guys. Charlene, what do you think? What would you like to
truth.
I do. I was in government, man.
So I have a different experience with RFPs. We are a nonprofit. We administer 105 PACE programs now. We do it at no cost to local government. We get a user fee paid by the owners that voluntarily access the program. It would be really easy to do what I do, making money, zeroing in on the big developers and the biggest projects. But we committed to serve all of Texas, border, rural, urban, underserved communities, as well as the big projects, right? They make the world go round. We appreciate that. To do what I do, I wish the RFPs required significant outreach and education, which is our goal. That's what we try and do. But to find a way, how do we get local banks to become PACE lenders? How do we make sure that the roofers and the engineers and the HVAC folks and everybody involved in these projects understands it, so they know that they're going to sell more stuff, they're going to be installing more stuff instead of repairing, if they knew how to explain PACE to get owners to be willing to make these larger investments. So for me, it's education and it's outreach and it's continually building the community, bringing more people into the fold so that these projects actually happen.
Absolutely.
Different approach.
I think it's a great one. Claudio, what are your thoughts?
So we have a new member in our regional council here in South Texas. He's a landscape architect, and we met with him last week. We're just catching up, all of our members in the South. He was talking about how he's modifying the ordinances in the city of Bronzeville, landscape ordinances, based on his expertise. So the city trusts what he's doing, right? And I was like, just as simple as that? Yeah, I mean, they're voting for the things that I do, and because they trust me, I have all these years of experience, and I started thinking about it. We need some of us within, writing the RFQs that can, like my wish list would be as simple as get me 3 options, the design phase of a combination of mechanical systems, iterations or options, plus building envelope iterations or options, plus renewable energy systems, right? In the design team. And that will get the actual, whoever, whether it's that city or whatever entity is that will get them in trouble, because once they get them, they'll see the money cost, but a life cycle cost in like plain word, like very well done with a study period matching the building period. They will get the graphics, they would see, oh wow, okay, this will get back in 10 years, 15 years, I think that's my deepest wish, that somebody can actually trust somebody within the entity to make this happen.
I think that's really interesting, and I think I also just want to point out that that's something that the U.S. Green Building Council, particularly in Texas, I think has done very well, as we've become a trusted and pragmatic advisor to a lot of different clients and institutions. I think that we come to the table with the breadth of expertise that is our membership. So when those clients are looking to put together that RFP and they're not sure, this stuff is intimidating if you don't live in it every day. And so, I encourage folks to reach out to groups like USGBC to get that information, so that those RFQs, those RFPs are more relevant to what they really want, and then these guys can really deliver better. Okay, one last question, and then we're going to have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. If we get this right, guys, if value truly starts to drive decisions over cost, what does the Texas building landscape look like 10 years from today? So, Charlene, 10 years from today, when you and I are saying, okay, 20 years ago we did this, what does the building landscape look like if we get this right?
It's healthy and people still live here.
Rock on. Absolutely. That's a perfect answer. Lauren, what do you think?
I mean, I'm echoing that. I completely agree. And you have building occupancy that reflects the buildings that have been built with great quality, and with the life cycle assessments that have shown, hey, these new features that we can implement are worth it.
Absolutely. Riley?
Yeah, I think back to Chris's slide earlier this morning in terms of high performance buildings, there's a clear benefit to getting there. And once we kind of bring the average pool up there, there are net benefits for the entire community that we can speak towards. So I think it's really, just building better, healthier buildings at the end of the day, and being able to not feel bad about including sustainability in some of those design guidelines.
Fantastic. Claudio?
If that happens, I really wish that to see that the statistics from the population, the health statistics will really reflect on that. Mortality rates or, sickness, whatever.
Exactly. But if we don't stop wasting water, there's not going to be enough water for the growth into Texas. If we don't stop wasting power, the amount of money it's going to cost to move power it's exorbitant. So there's really not a choice anymore.
I absolutely agree. We really don't have a choice anymore. This is not something that I think we can ignore or just sort of brush off as a premium, right? This is something that is absolutely necessary for our communities and for our future. And I just want to remind everybody that all these years ago we talked about people, planet, prosperity, right? That's what we're still talking about, right? And what we want to see is a not just a stable, but an excellent environment in all those three areas. So with that, Jonathan, do we want to take some questions from the audience? You can steal my microphone. And I'm
All
going
right.
to sit down.
All right, come over here to Mr. Melton.
You can share.
So thank you all, and appreciate the focus on the value added. Outside the building envelope, I'm sure you're familiar with Christopher Lineberger and his walk-up, wake-up study. And certainly, in terms of the health of the occupants of the building, if I'd be curious to know your take on how important that walkable perimeter and connectivity to the goods and services and places people go without having to start a car and drive. Thanks for the applause.
Yeah, maybe I'll start from my side. So we've done a lot of work on health impacts and active mobility. So you can obviously estimate the greenhouse gases avoided from firing up your car and going into the grocery store, but there's cardiovascular benefits from actually walking from regular exercise for 15 minutes plus a day. So there are some tangible impacts that you can tie to the health side. And I think beyond that, in terms of interconnectivity, there's also a lot of good community-based revenue generation. So by having more interconnected businesses, that a lot of the businesses thrive together. So there's a lot of good economic impacts you're able to tie to one singular design strategy, as you just mentioned.
I'd like to add to that if I can. I'm just doing your microphone. I was applauding. I got very excited just now when you said that because as someone that is, working and serving the public for so many years, as that kind of an institution, you're thinking about not just your own costs as an institution, but you're thinking about what the costs are to your community. And one of the things that would aggravate me the most is that some of the best strategies are not technological. Some of the best strategies don't cost a dime if you're doing it when you're wielding a pencil and not a shovel. And so in terms of development, we talk about affordability and cost. Housing and transportation cost index is an extremely important tool that should be used when we're talking about, I'm going to invest this much money in this building and where it is and what it has access to, not because it reduces the bottom line that I'm paying on the building, but because it ultimately reduces the burden on my people. And that's why I got excited. So.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking one. If I were to do an RFP, it begins by asking the person, because I think that a lot of what we're talking about is pure semantics. I would like to know what their concept of value over cost is, and also the fact that both of them have similarities and both of them have differences, and each one has different strategies. So I would ask about the strategies, and there are a lot of strategies to do that. But the point I really want to make is the following. We're talking about two words that seem to be at odds with each other. Cost is very quantitative. I have the whole idea of CapEx and OpEx and life cycle, everything is quantitative. But the whole idea of value is qualitative. And they do not come in easy formulas. And the people that generate or are affected by the value are never on the table when things are being designed. So you need to really change a little bit the process. I am looking at this from several lenses. Started as an architect, continued in engineering, focused on construction management, been on both sides of the academic fence on that. And right now, I think that the biggest missing thing are the people that live in those buildings. It's not an architectural thing. It's not a financial spreadsheet. We don't include the people because, first of all, many times you don't even know who's going to be part of that company. And they change. And with a new generational change, that's going to be even worse. And the last thing I'm just going to say, maybe it's a comment rather than a question. We focus too much on nouns. And the nouns are very easy to quantify. But we never focus on the verbs. You don't build schools, you enable education. You don't build hospitals, you enable health. So what are the 3 ROIs? Return on investment, easy. But what's the return on impact? What's the cost of one life saved in the hospital? What's the cost of one kid that ends up being a Nobel Prize winner at a good school? So we don't measure impact. And just like the millennials are now influencers, how are we influencing the conversation all across? So maybe this is more like a rant than a question, but it is very thought-provoking to hear you all talk about that.
I need to write that down.
Yeah, so totally agree with your point there, and I think the one thing that I'll raise here is that economic models have been around for a long time to capture some of these benefits. Just because they don't end up on the same spreadsheet of a financial ROI does not mean that those impacts or disbenefits from poorly designing a space doesn't occur. So for us at AutoCase, that's really where we are able to kind of leverage some of those economic models to help quantify and put things on an apples-to-apples basis to compare against upfront capital costs versus a live loss, for example. We do a lot of work in urban heat island reduction, for example. There's some crude ways of valuing an economic life. Economists like to put dollar figures on everything, but it's called the value of statistical life. So there's many different frameworks that we can use across cost benefit to actually measure these impacts. The unfortunate part is that they're just not traditionally mandated to show what type of trade-offs I'm having from my own bottom line compared to the burden I'm putting on the community. That has never been demanded in these RFPs, but I think to your point, very real impacts and a very real exercise that should be applied across building design.
They need to get into the universities.
I'm actually very excited about the question that you asked, and I shamelessly am going to say that this is actually part of the reason that I've started this company that I'm now running. One of our goals as a company is to get with institutions like cities and school districts, healthcare providers, and others, and start to talk to them about what their strategic priorities as an institution are. What outcomes are they looking for? Because once we understand as an institution what outcomes we seek to achieve, it's not about sort of creating an RFP from scratch that suddenly incorporates these qualifiers or whatever it is. It's about understanding that as a city, what is our role? What should we be providing our residents? And as the RFP we just released support that. So it's a little bit of a pulling it back, but that is actually the core purpose of Parade on Main and why I started that company. So I'm really glad you said that. Do we have time for some more? Yes? Oh, please.
Okay, I have a very quick and simple question for Riley. So I'm a sustainability strategist with Gensler, and I use AutoCase for exactly what we are talking about today. My question is, in terms of inflation and the uncertainty that we have right now, how do you cater to inflation to your cost estimates? Like, how's that?
Yeah, so we typically rely on the experts within that respective field. So for things like PV solar cost benchmarks, we pull those from NREL, for example. So we'll always try to pull the latest and greatest, whether it's coming from academic, government sources, and that's really how we try to keep a breath across some of these varying changes of costs. I think where we really are able to provide a bit more of a different lens is mainly on the escalation side of things. So what more you expect to pay for water utility bills in 2030 versus 2025. We're able to provide a lot more of those type of cost escalation factors that really, I think, marry into that business case a bit better. So we're not trying to necessarily estimate a solar panel change from 2015 to 2025. Those more serve as inputs within our analysis.
Hey, I really appreciate the conversation. One thing that struck me was PACE is very special in the sense it's outcome-oriented financing. It says, hey, I'm looking to put this in the stack. One thing that struck me when you guys were talking about value engineering was that often the investor's not in anywhere near that room. Essentially, the design team is value engineering, and they're out making a decision. Hey, what do I do? You were asking, that marginal $1 million. The investor, the ultimate investor, may or may not have been fine to find another $1 million to put in the project, but they're not in that room. So, do you feel like PACE kind of is a bridge? But is there a case for providing more? It just strikes me that there's that disconnect. Yeah, how there, because there is capital for some of those things, but there's not capital during the value engineering phase. Like capital's going down, not in. And the end investor is getting a lesser product from it. Do you feel like if we had more, do you feel like investors, if they were given the opportunity to support some of those things, they would deploy more capital? Or do you feel like, and thus the communications problem, or do you think, hey, that's just too walled off, it's too late, it's too close to the shovel? I'm curious about your reaction.
It's a great question. And the more educated the investors are, the more likely they are to use PACE. And you're right, if they were aware of this, not only because they can access cheaper capital, but a lot of the investors have bought into ESG. I know we don't use those words in Texas, but they're under pressure to deliver the operational savings. We still have a lot of investors and developers who are just throwing up buildings and selling them and moving on. That is a real problem. But for those, I mean, where the real money is right now, people are thinking long term. And this is not an environment where they're throwing money at anything. So the project has to make sense, short and long term. But the more they know about PACE, and the more the people designing the buildings or undesigning the buildings know where the investor's coming from, the more likely they're going to look long term. It's a great question.
Guys, this is such a good conversation. I don't know, it says 000 there, so I have no idea how far over we are, but I want to take 1 second to just thank each one of you for being here today. But more than that, I want to thank each one of you for doing what you do every single day, because Texans appreciate you. And I don't think we get told thank you enough. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here today, and thank you for giving me the privilege of moderating this panel.
Thank you, Nicole.